Right, hi, I'm Ken Taylor, and I've been hauled in at the last minute to do a talk, so this has not been really very well prepared, and I offered yesterday afternoon as a result of cancellation to just give a bit of a talk about the sweat house experience, which we conduct on a reasonably regular basis, and it was something I felt I could do at the drop of a hat, so here I am doing it, number one. So for those of you who aren't aware, there's alternative names to the sweat house. I use the term sweat house, but you're probably more familiar with it as sweat lodge in the North American Indian tradition. And that's probably the one that's most extant, the one that we're most familiar with, although we probably don't see it as in its full context, where it's usually part of ceremonial process, ritual process and spiritual structure and tradition. But I also want to point out that it's not peculiar to the North American Indian population. It's also present in Asia, Scandinavia, and is most probably an existing situation, or was an existing situation in Celtic lands. There's some evidence that's recently come up on the ABC, I don't know whether you've seen it, about sweat houses over the recent millennia, even while Christian tradition was there, which has tended to obscure it. But it seems like it's a fairly pervasive phenomenon that most societies, most traditional societies, and most non-Christian societies use some sort of sweating ceremonial process. And a lot of houses that have been discovered, which have been found not to have things like crockery underneath it, for example, and everybody says, well, I wonder what the hell they're there for. It's realised that there are probably houses for ceremonial purpose, and some of the constructs are very enclosed, so it looks like they were used for sweating purposes. So it's worth putting it in some sort of context with that it's also a community-based thing, and it's traditional across, and it's being revived now as we know. There's a lot of people performing sweat house ceremonies of variable quality, but they're there, and I've been now conducting sweats from my own background, which is Anglo-Celtic. I'm a practicing Druid, and I've been performing sweats for about 25 years, so I've done several hundred, probably about 1,000 all up, I suppose, on a fairly regular basis for a variety of purposes, mainly ritual, sometimes for a cleanse, and gradually over time what I've tried to do is to evolve that into a more Celtic or Anglo-Celtic format, so that we're addressing, I think, an undercurrent in our traditions and backgrounds, which is, I think, not so well looked at in our society. There's a lot of that's been given a sort of bit of a new age veneer, and there's a lot of sweat lodges out there which aren't of the highest quality, and there's been one or two tragedies which have occurred with people who have either used them inappropriately, got the temperatures too hot, sometimes used a mixture of other substances, hallucinogenic substances, and created a few problems. So it's got a bit of bad press, which I think is a bit of a shame, but I think this will evolve over time. Yeah, a lot of issues, yeah, physically, but dehydration has been the main one that's got people, and particularly if they're using things like hallucinogens, then they can often get into a space where they don't recognise they're thirsty.
So does it just follow like a sauna?
Yeah, well, I'll come on to the process in a little bit about that, because it's and I'll be doing it from my perspective, so please bear that in mind. I've, right from the word go, was quite keen to develop it around my own spiritual direction. As I said, I've been a practicing Druid. I was ordained about 25 years ago in an earth spirit tradition, and I've always been fairly keen to have provided a more Northern European bent to what was going on. The people I worked with and trained with came from the Lakota tradition, and used a sweat process which was one that I've kind of adapted, although there's a lot of overlap, and people like Lewis was probably recognised as a familiarity with what he's experienced in the past. But firstly, I want to also point out the association with health and where the sweat lodge fits in the health process. I don't know whether you know, but the word health itself is derived from the Old English word hal, which also means healing, wholeness, and even holiness. So there's kind of a spiritual perspective to health, which I think we often ignore and we tend to separate from. And a lot of health that I've been involved in over the years, particularly when I was practicing medicine holistically, was that holism was seen as being a sort of continuum around the physical end of the spectrum. People call themselves holistic if they dealt with the brain and the heart and the other organs, and didn't see that necessarily the mind as part of that. And if they did, they certainly didn't include the spirit, right? And I think it's important when you look at holism that we do have that sort of continuum, which is known as the perennial philosophy after Aldous Huxley. So if you check that out, where there's a continuum between the body, the mind, and the spirit, right, which we all sort of pay homage to. But to see them as equal is inappropriate. I tend to sort of see the spirit as inclusive of mind and inclusive of body. And I tend to see health as being embodied. There is a sort of tendency in our society with the separation of body and mind, particularly to see the spirit as being somewhat detached. And the New Age hasn't really helped in that sort of process. And I think there's a great need for reunification. That sort of complex of body, mind, and spirit in the individual, I tend to see as the soul, which is also a term which has been rather denigrated in our society, and one I think is in sore need of reinstatement, because we tend to use the term mind for soul, and I think that's inappropriate. The mind I see as the sort of cognitive mental processes that are associated more closely with the body. So I think it's important to see both the what I call the great chain of being, which is the perennial philosophy, that sort of continuum, because the sweat encompasses that. It's embodied. We go in physically and we start physically, and then we are engaging other dimensions with that. Right? So the way we conduct the sweat is we have an underground sweat, which is about 4 meters in diameter, 4 or 5 meters in diameter. It's mainly underground, and that's basically a personal choice. It doesn't have to be. In traditional societies, they tended to be made above ground and often made temporarily, particularly in North American traditions. And they would dismantle afterwards. And this is one reason why there is very scant evidence for the sweat processes, because of this dismantling process, where fire is used, they're assembled, trees are often chopped down, blah, 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 blah. But obviously in Australia, that presents a certain amount of problems with the weather. So what we've done is we've made and dug a sort of circular area underground, about from a metre Paul away, probably a bit less, metre Rosie. And we've gone about 3-4 feet down, and we've domed it and enclosed it, and we've got permanent rocks in the centre, and these have a gas burner underneath with an external gas source, and we fire the gas up for about 3 hours to get the rocks hot. Rocks are about yay big, and they're volcanic, so they don't split and spit out and hiss anything. We have a ventilation system so that when we turn the gas off, and when the rocks are hot after about 3 hours, any excess fumes from the gas goes out with the ventilation process, and that's never been a problem. And in fact, gas that we get down here seems remarkably clean, and we've never had any difficulty with it. So that preparation occurs before. Then what we do is we undertake a ritual process, usually. We've got a ceremonial circle which we use, although we're developing one around the sweat as well, but we've got a separate circle which we often use as a way of priming ourselves, if you like, moving into a different space, so that we are aware of what's going on when we go in there, and so we take that sort of process with us, that sort of familiarity with us. We often do things like smudge first. That's use a sage stick as a cleansing process, as an auric cleansing process, and then people go into the sweat in silence, and we form a circle around the rocks, and we enter the one we enter into is from the west, but alternatively the east is a place to enter, and I'll come to the reasons for that in a minute. We form a circle, and we tend to move, what we do is move anti-clockwise, and the Celtic term for that is diosel, which means sunwise, because we're in the southern hemisphere, so we do it anti-clockwise. So we're reflecting the movement of the heavens that we're familiar with. In the northern hemisphere, it's the reverse. So we move in and form a circle, and we can get quite a few people in there. We've had 40 in 2 rows at one stage. Normally there's usually about a dozen people. Can you imagine 40 in there? It's quite tight. And that adds its own atmosphere. And people go in lightly robed, although you can go in naked, but we tend to use a light robing process. Some people disrobe when they're in there. This is all in silence. You move in, and the issue then is that you're basically undergoing a sensory deprivation. After the smudging, you're moving into a darkened space. There's an absence of noise. The touch is different. The sound is different. The smell is different because of the auras that we've created, and the heat itself, which you meet and engage when you move in, takes you into a slightly different space. And we use breath, obviously, to focus, and use breath particularly if people are at all strained, physiologically strained while they're doing the sweat. So that's basically it. We've got people then in the sweat process for up to about an hour, sitting around in a circle, panting away for a little while they acclimatise and accustom themselves. Acclimatise, in fact, it's dark. They're shut off from the surroundings. They've got a different sort of sense, often primed by the ritual process and the smudging that we've done. And preparing for me usually, but other people also. April has run some sweats, and I'm teaching her how to do them. And Lewis will have done some, no doubt. And I then start the process, and the process starts with an orientation, because what we're doing is, while we're physiologically challenged, while we're being physically challenged by the sweating process and the breathing process that goes along with that, often with a little bit of encouragement about breathing patterns, but I tend to minimise that and leave it up to the individual to develop their own, and my vigilance is watching for anybody who's getting distressed. So physiologically, while that challenging process is occurring, I then use a ritual process and conduct a movement around the circle with the quarters, which mark the solstices and the equinoxes, so the sun and the movement of the sun through the day, night and day, the seasons, the years. So we also introduce Celtic Festivals, and there's 4 of those which interspace the equinoxes and the solstices. And we've recently started to introduce the 6 lunar seasons, and we're moving around those and integrating that. So we're actively working to try and make an integration process out of our cultural background and the existing cultural background here, which we think is respectful and part of the challenge of being here in Australia. You know, I'm of Anglo-Celtic heritage. I was born in Britain. I bring that here. I think I meet tradition here by acknowledging my own tradition. So the sweat process then is conducted. We undertake a prayer process if necessary, but mainly it's built around chants. I have a chant process which we use on a regular basis, and some of you may be familiar with this. It's called the Charm of Making, and it's in Gaelic, and it goes Anal Nathrak Uthas Bethud Dachial Dienve. And for any of you who are film buffs, you might recognise that from the film Excalibur by John Boorman, which was made about 40 years ago. And if you've not seen it, highly recommend it, where Merlin paints a very sort of seductive picture of the magician and uses that chant on a regular basis. So we use that chant, which means something like breath of spirit, spell of life and death, or charm of life and death, charm of making, or omen of making. That's the Gaelic derivation, which is actually from Old Irish. So we have 3 processes where I put water, hot water, over the rocks, raise the temperature and do that over successive phases, 1, 2, 3, where we increase the heat to a maximum on the third charge. So it's Ananathrak for 1, Uthvas Bethut for the second, Dachiel Diende for the third. And by the time we get to the third, hopefully the rocks are hot enough that your ears tinge a bit and your lungs start to feel it a bit. And people are just about on the edge of their tolerance, but not pushed too hard, because the idea is to keep everybody together if we can. And at that stage, most people are with a combination of the ritual, the ceremony, and the chanting process have moved into an altered state of consciousness. That's supported, depending on the ceremony, depending on the ritual, depending on the time of the year, supported by me giving some instruction about what may be going on, or maybe leading something verbally in that altered state of an imaginative process, looking for visions. Basically, it's a mini vision quest, which is also a term borrowed from North American tradition. Then we drop the heat, maybe say a couple of prayers, close the sweat, come out, all in silence, hose down. We don't have ice baths, but in Scandinavian places they do. And then we relax, and it takes about half an hour, 45 minutes to come back into your body. So for that period, anything that happens or any visionary process is ongoing. So we tend to remain relatively silent during that period. And then after about 30, 45 minutes, we relax, share some food, share some time together, and that's the end of the process. How's that all sound? Has everybody done one? Or has anybody not done one? Well, if you're interested in doing one, you're welcome.
For anybody?
For anybody, yeah. April's the person, my go-to person. So if you do all know April, and if you're not, I've got some business cards here. If anybody wants to, just take a card and chase up my website, and you'll find contact details there. Or go to Facebook, Canon Taylor in Facebook, and you'll find what I'm doing and what I'm about. Also, in about 2 weeks' time, I'm going to be giving an evening talk, and I think you'll see the flyers dotted around here, on shamanic medicine. Oh, there's some there as well. Yep. On shamanic medicine. It's an evening talk at the Albany Body Mind Centre, Health Centre in Lockyer Avenue. You're welcome to come along to those. And if you're interested in doing a sweat, contact me personally. Thank you. Anybody got any questions? Have we got time for questions? Yeah? Anybody got any questions?
What would your recommendation be if people might be a bit claustrophobic?
Being what?
A bit claustrophobic.
You're going to get mental challenges. One of the things about the sweat is that health and mental health challenges are usually negotiated relatively comfortably by the process. We've had people with, I'm a doctor, although I'm no longer in practice. I've got 40 odd years of experience. So I've had people in who've had health conditions of a whole range of natures. I actually use it for people with health conditions on a private basis, because it's a very good way of actually challenging and overcoming health issues and getting a different spiritual perspective of them. And that's particularly true also of mental health problems. So people with claustrophobia, and we've had several, have found that if they can get in there, they stay. We've never had anybody leave who's got a claustrophobic issue. Once they get through the door, settle, the process itself, because it's naturally healing, transports them. And because you're getting an altered state and a spiritual perspective, this kind of feeds back into the mental and physical states. And it's particularly good just for a physical cleanse. When I was here on a regular basis, we used to do them on Monday nights. So people would have their weekend cleanse. So the heavy duty weekend of food and drink, Monday nights would be very, very popular for people just to come and literally get shit out of their system. Yep. All sound simple? Sound like fun? Thank you very much.
So, Canon, is it just the main dates that you're doing around the seasons, or are you doing it weekly? Like, what's the guide?
Well, at the moment we're doing 12. We're doing the equinoxes and the solstices, which correspond two of them. The solstices correspond with the change in Aboriginal seasons. We're doing the 4 festivals, so we're doing Imbolc, Beltane, Lugnasa and Samhain, or Halloween, as the 4 Celtic. And we're doing the 4 seasons that don't coincide with the 2 of the solstices. So the seasonal changes of the Noongar tradition that coincide with the solstices are embodied in the solstice sweats, and then the 4 other ones that we're doing with the change, like we've just done the change from Mukaru to Jilbar and to Camberang. We've just done that one because that coincided. So we do a total of 12. There is occasional full moon one, and there's occasional others, and I'll probably start doing them on a more regular basis. Particularly as interested people want to do a sweat, what usually we do is, for people who are new and have never done a sweat before, is do an introductory one separately. So 2 or 3 people may come along and who's it's a little bit lighter and a little bit more familiar, so that they're accustomed to the experience before they move into doing the others, which are usually a little bit more challenging. But it's not as threatening as it sounds. It sounds fairly challenging, but it's a great way of communing, and it's my church. It's where I go to actually commune and automatically sort of reset and get a new fix on things. And it's a great thing to do if you're bugging in your head about things. Things are challenging you and pulling you around, to actually go in and get a clarity of perception, because you're going beyond that, what you're doing, and looking back in on it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.